Okay, so we are going to start talking about biomes, and we've been talking about the characteristics of ecosystems and what happens in ecosystems. Now we're going to talk about the places where all of these ecosystems, where all these organisms interact. So if you look at a biome, it's an area that shares a combination of yearly temperature and average precipitation. They're all going to have similar characteristics. So rainforests are all going to have similar temperatures and precipitation averages. Same thing with the taiga, the tundra, and the desert. The thing is that the climate directly determines the community of organisms that live there, which means that the plants and animals are uniquely adapted to live there. For example, organisms that live in the desert are going to be uniquely adapted to preserve water. Things in the grasslands or the deciduous forests are going to have to be able to store nutrients and water in terms of long areas or times without water. And some areas are prone to fire, so they have to be adapted to survive in fire-prone ecosystems. If you take a look at this graph, the biomes are characterized based on their precipitation and their temperature. So the warmest ecosystem with the highest temperatures are tropical rainforests, then temperate rainforests, temperate seasonal forest, which is a deciduous forest. But as you move away from that warmer temperature, you get closer to the tundra and the taiga. You can also predict where on Earth biomes can be found based on their longitude and latitude mostly. The tundra and boreal forest or taiga, they're going to be in the higher latitudes closer to the poles. The temperate ecosystems, temperate rainforests, temperate grasslands, temperate deciduous forests, those are going to be in the middle latitudes, and the tropical ecosystems like deserts and rainforests are going to be closer to the equator. All these biomes are determined and defined by their precipitation and annual temperatures. They're also impacted by the latitude, so distance from the equator, but also the altitude, how high up they are. And then remember, we still have that rain shadow effect that can increase or decrease the likelihood of deserts in certain areas. The plants in each ecosystem need nutrients in order to grow. So depending on the ecosystem, the type of soil that's there, that's going to also impact the ability for plants to survive. So for example, in the tundra, those frozen soils don't allow any organisms to have deeper roots. It also slows down decomposition. So that means you have low soil nutrients, low water availability, and very few plants surviving in the tundra year round. So if you take a look at this image here, you've got the permafrost, which is the permanently frozen ecosystem here. Permanently frozen soil here. You only have a little bit of soil where plants can actually get their roots in to get nutrients, and there's not a lot of water that's going to be stored there. The tropical rainforest generally has nutrient-poor soils. That's because there is high competition from so many different types of plants. The nutrient-poor soil and increased competition also explains why rainforests aren't growing back after they're cut down. There's not enough nutrients for new plants to root and grow. Boreal forests are also relatively nutrient-poor because they have slow decomposition due to their lower temperatures. And then temperate forests are going to be the most nutrient-rich soil, lots of dead organic matter. Think about the forests and areas around here, lots of fallen leaves, dead trees, all that's decomposing, and the changing temperatures allows for that decomposition to be faster at certain parts of the year. Due to climate change, we're seeing a shift in biomes. Because the warming climate, we're seeing that boreal forests or taigas, whichever you want to call them, are shifting further north and almost pushing the tundra out of their natural ecosystem. So you're seeing more forest, less tundra, and it's becoming warm enough for plants to put their roots down and start growing. And the permafrost, because it's melting, those roots are able to root in the soil and continue to grow. So this shows you where you've got more mature trees starting to grow because of the melting permafrost. This is in 1962, and this is like the ecotone. The ecotone is the area where two biomes sort of start to run together. So this is an area where you'd see trees decreasing and the tundra increasing, like you see up here. So less mature trees, and these trees most likely wouldn't survive, whereas now they're able to survive and thrive in those ecosystems. All right. So if you take a look at this FRQ, try to think of one characteristics of a biome and explain how it determines the community of organisms. So think about what defines a biome and how that impacts the ecosystem. We're also going to talk about aquatic biomes quickly. Aquatic biomes are defined a little bit differently, not precipitation and temperature, but the salinity, the depth, the flow, and the temperature of the water. So salinity is obviously how much salt is in a body of water. The amount of salt determines the species that can survive there and how much can be used for drinking for other organisms. So we've got freshwater, which is obviously very low salinity, estuary, which is brackish water or a mixture of fresh and salt water, think bays, like the Chesapeake Bay, and then the ocean, which is the highest salinity, which is salt water, it's the ocean. The depth of the ecosystem, so how far down into the water are you talking about? That determines the amount of sunlight that can penetrate and reach plants below the surface of the water. And then the flow is how quickly the water is moving, which impacts the organisms that can take root and survive in that water, as well as how much oxygen can be dissolved in that water. And the last one is temperature. Warmer water is going to have less dissolved oxygen, so it's supporting fewer aquatic organisms. The temperature just impacts how much of the oxygen can actually stay dissolved in the water. So freshwater ecosystems include rivers, lakes, streams, and ponds. Rivers tend to have a higher oxygen content because the flow of the water, that increased flow of the water, mixes water and air. It also moves nutrient-rich sediments, which allows for bacteria to break down dead and organic matters, and it allows plants to root in the water as well along the edges. And then lakes are standing bodies of fresh water. They tend to be a key drinking source for all organisms. Within a lake, you've got 4 different zones. You've got the shallow water where you have emergent plants. That's called the littoral zone. That's along like the lake's edge. Then you've got the limnetic zone where light can reach. So you're talking about away from the shore and deep enough where light is still penetrating so you can have photosynthetic organisms living there, algae and plants. Floating plants. The profundal zone is too deep for sunlight, so there's no photosynthesis happening there. And then benthic, or the benthos, that's the lowest part of the lake. That's that murky bottom where you're going to see invertebrates, bugs, decomposers living. There's nutrient-rich sediment down there, but there's no sunlight, so there's no photosynthesis. Wetlands are also an extremely important ecosystem. Wetlands are defined as areas that are submerged or saturated in water for at least part of the year. They're shallow enough for the emergent plants, things like cattails, lily pads, and reeds. They are used to having their roots submerged. Normally when plants' roots are submerged for too long, they tend to suffocate and die, but these plants have evolved to survive that ecosystem. Wetlands are able to store excess water during storms, which decreases flooding. It recharges groundwater by absorbing that rainfall and allowing it to percolate through the soil. The roots of those wetland plants also filter out pollutants that are coming from the water that are being carried in from the local ecosystems. And then lots of nutrients and decomposition happening. If you've ever walked past a wetland or a marsh, they're kind of stinky. That's because there's lots of decomposition happening in that ecosystem. So these are all examples. You've got freshwater wetlands, and marshes are saltwater wetlands, and swamps are another example of a wetland. All right, so here's a marsh. You've got reeds and cattails here, and then a bog is another freshwater wetland. You've got lots of spruce trees and sphagnum mosses. The cypress tree you see in the Gulf of Mexico, like in Louisiana. Estuaries. Estuaries are areas where rivers empty into the ocean. So where the Delaware River empties into the ocean, that's the Delaware Bay. The Chesapeake River empties into the rivers from Pennsylvania empty into the Chesapeake Bay. So it's a mix of fresh and salt water, otherwise known as brackish water. Species adapt to this to live in these ecosystems. So estuaries, another example of an estuary is a mangrove, and mangrove trees have evolved to adapt or have evolved to survive in these ecosystems. Estuaries have high productivity, so lots of plants, lots of nutrients in the water, and lots of ecosystems to survive. Around those estuaries, you have salt marshes. So salt marshes are a type of wetland, but they are bordering estuaries. It is a habitat in temperate climates. So we have we have marshes in the Chesapeake Bay. And if you go to Wallops Island, you're going to see them. Estuaries and salt marshes tend to be breeding grounds for lots of fish and shellfish. And then mangrove swamps are those tropical climates. They are being actually destroyed now for shrimp farms. They have trees that are along the shoreline, and they provide habitat for species of fish and shellfish to reproduce. They have long roots. You've probably seen a mangrove tree. They have these longer roots that sort of stick out of the water, but they're able to survive with those submerged roots like we talked about in those wetlands. The coral reef is the most diverse marine ecosystem. They have lots of mutualistic relationships like we talked about, the coral and the algae. They interact with each other in order to survive. Both species rely on each other. So without them, one without the other, they tend to die off in this region. So without the algae, the coral would die off, and without the coral, the algae would die off because they would have no home. Intertidal zones, those are the beaches. It's the part of the coastline between high and low tide. So depending on where you live, you could have a rocky intertidal zone. So the west coast is going to have a more rocky ecosystem where you are going from like a cliff into the water. They have to be able to survive crashing waves and direct sunlight during low tide. So they are exposed during low tide and submerged during high tide. They also have shells and tougher outer skins to prevent them from drying out during the low tides, and the low tides can vary depending on the place. If you look at this image over here, different organisms are going to survive in different zones. So based on how long they can be submerged and how long they can be unsubmerged, they're going to survive in different ecosystems, different parts of the ecosystem, excuse me. The open ocean is actually the equivalent of a desert in aquatic ecosystems. They have very low productivity. There's very little plant life. The only thing that is providing nourishment at the base of the food chain is algae and phytoplankton. That does produce a lot of oxygen, though, and absorb a lot of CO2. So the open ocean is actually one of our greatest carbon sinks, meaning it absorbs lots of CO2 for the Earth. You still have the same sort of thing as the lake. You have the photic zone. That's where sunlight can reach, so you have photosynthesis. You have the aphotic zone, which is too deep for sunlight, so it's dark, or the abyssal plain. And then you have the aphotic zone, has these organisms that are adapted to that darker ecosystem. So you think of I can't think of the name of the fish. The anglerfish, thank you, there it is. The anglerfish has that light, everybody thinks of Dory. But in these ecosystems, you have very little productivity. Closer to the base of the ocean is where you see the most productivity because you have decomposition happening there. But the open ocean is actually the desert of the aquatic ecosystems, where the coral reef is the rainforest of the aquatic ecosystems. So if you think about the aquatic ecosystems, try to identify an organism that's in an aquatic biome and explain how it's adapted to live in that ecosystem. All right, that's it, everybody. So remember, if cauliflower can be pizza, you can be anything.